I want to bring in now Chief Economic Correspondent at Axios, Neil Irwin, and Rick Newman, author of The Pinpoint Press on Substack and former senior columnist for Yahoo Finance. You know, Neil, this is the first ever joint opening bell event with both the New York Stock Exchange and the NASDAQ. It's also at the White House. What do you make of all that?
Look, the president is hitching his wagon to the booming stock market, saying this is an achievement he's very proud of, taking credit for it. It's a risky maneuver. There's an old line in politics: you live by the stock market, die by the stock market. We'll inevitably get a correction one day, and if that happens while he's still president, he might have to own that. But for now, the stock market really is hitting new highs every week. It seems like the president is proud to celebrate that.
So, Rick, let's talk about the reason for this event, which is those Trump accounts. Of course, everyone can agree that it's a good idea to invest in the future by securing kids' financial situations. But will these accounts actually be effective?
Well, so what's going to happen? I mean, you've got 18 years if you get this account, and everybody should. It's free money. Everybody who qualifies should do this. So you've got 18 years. I mean, the stock market doesn't always go up, but probably over 18 years, that money will appreciate, and you'll have more than the $1,000 you started with. You can add to it along the way if you want. I think there are a couple problems with it, though. First of all, I hate the branding. I mean, Trump accounts. I mean, people are going to think they're going to hear about this, and they're not going to know this is the U.S. government. They're going to think, is this another Trump?
It's a personal project.
Yes, and they might think of Trump coin. And say to themselves, wait a minute, everybody who bought Trump coin lost their shirts, so why would I want anything to do with this? So if they were doing it right, they'd really have to market it as just get the money. You can't. It is the federal government. It's not Trump. Why does it end in 2028? It's obviously just 4 years. I mean, obviously, that's blatantly political.
I wonder.
And there's this one other thing, which is when you turn 18, there are incentives to keep the money invested, but you can actually take it out as cash when you're 18. So by my math, that's going to be 2043 when the first 18-year-old is able to do that. And I think we're going to hear some interesting stories about 18-year-olds just cashing out and who knows what with the money.
Thank you for doing the math for us. Do you have any good creative names that it should have been called instead?
A Patriot account. I don't love Patriot, an overused word. It should be called something boring, like government investment account or something.
Neil, several private companies have announced donations to these accounts. Perhaps the biggest one is from Dell. Last week, President Trump suggested that maybe SpaceX could join the party and donate as well. How unique is it to have public-private savings programs like this? And could it make a difference in setting future generations up for financial success?
I mean, it's a very unusual situation. Like, we've seen versions of this going back, if you're old enough to remember the George W. Bush ownership society concept, talk of private accounts tied to Social Security. That didn't happen. But normally we have 401ks, IRAs that are tax protected accounts established in law. But you have a lot of freedom and it's not like you're receiving funds from the government to fund those. That's what makes this different. If we get in a situation where SpaceX, where OpenAI, where some of these companies are gifting shares to citizens, to individual people through this government mechanism, it does raise interesting questions about the relationship between the private sector and the public sector. Is this really an arm's length donation, or is this a kind of thing that questions, what is the government getting for this thing that these companies are offering? So it really is creating some murky lines around the private sector, the public sector, how they intersect. But as we heard, if it's free money, it makes sense to take it as an individual.
Yeah, and people are hurting out there. So the idea of any kind of free money is probably very appealing. So the big question, Neil, is the president is celebrating the launch of these Trump accounts, going to help kids for the future, but he's not signing the bipartisan housing bill that Congress has passed. He calls that a yawn. Is the president focusing enough on kitchen table issues? Are these Trump accounts enough to mitigate some of the concerns out there?
Look, the reality is that only roughly half of the population has exposure to the stock market. Focusing on the stock market and not on everyday cost of living, housing, groceries, energy are the kinds of things that can really bite a party in November. Look, we'll see what happens with gas prices. We'll see what happens to overall inflation these next few months before the election, before the midterms. But in the meantime, look, we've had this strong stock market for years now, and it has not really moved the dial on consumer confidence, consumer sentiment. People are down on the economy, and the reason is prices at the grocery store, cost of living, kind of meat and potatoes issues. I'm not sure these new Trump accounts or even new highs in the stock market are going to change that dynamic.
Yeah, to Neil's point, Rick, the president kind of lives and dies when it comes to his economic policy by the stock market. He touts how it's up to record highs most days. But then there's this disclosure that he's had 21,000 stock trades made in his name. How do the American people read that? And in your opinion, who is this event that we're watching for? Is it for President Trump, or is it for the kids out there and their financial future?
So, first of all, I think most Americans are not watching Trump ring the opening bell at the stock market
They're
today.
watching us instead.
And people are, people don't put, a lot of voters, they don't create the cause and effect relationship. They don't say my housing costs are too expensive because Trump didn't sign the housing bill. What Trump is doing is he's giving people every reason to blame him. That people might hear, oh, there's a housing bill that might help and Trump won't sign it. I think he probably will sign it at some point. But he's creating this headline that he's standing in the way of affordable housing. He obviously gifted Democrats a campaign pitch when he said, I love the inflation on camera. I mean, people are just going to say, my costs are too high. Trump is the guy who says I love inflation. And just look at his approval numbers. I mean, his approval on handling of the economy and on inflation have absolutely collapsed. I mean, they're below Joe Biden levels during, when we had inflation at 9%. So it almost seems like he just doesn't care.
Well, and he actually said as much when it came to, whether he takes Americans' financial situation into account vis-a-vis the war in Iran. He said he frankly doesn't. So I want to talk to you, Neil, about OPEC now saying that it's going to produce more oil as the shipping resumes through the Strait of Hormuz. What's this going to do for global oil supply?
Yeah, look, we've already seen oil prices really plunge since the ceasefire and since things started to de-escalate with Iran. Now OPEC ramping up production. Look, global inventories of oil are really depleted because of this disruption to the Strait of Hormuz. So this creates the opportunity to rebuild those inventories and still have downward pressure on prices. That's good news for any consumer of oil, anybody filling up at the gas tank. It's a sign that these countries, they're depleted too. They've been losing money by not being able to export oil. They're trying to replenish their coffers. We can debate the long-term implications of this war and this conflict, but in the near term, it's good news for energy consumers around the world as the kind of floodgates are opening on oil.
For sure, good news that oil prices are coming down. How long it takes for the Americans to feel that at the pump is another question. Rick, Neil, thank you both so much. Appreciate you.